It was a frigid evening in a small, snow-covered town. The streets lay quiet under a blanket of white, illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. The air was sharp, biting against the skin of anyone brave enough to venture outside. Winter wasn't just a season here. It was a test of endurance. Amid the stillness, Alex Carter was on his way home. Alex, a young entrepreneur in his late 20s, had spent another long day juggling meetings and errands. His truck, an old but dependable companion, rattled softly as it navigated the icy roads. Inside, he hummed to himself, stealing moments of peace from a day that had demanded so much of him. His truck's heater hummed warmly, fighting the cold outside, but Alex's thoughts were already at home. He envisioned the simple comforts waiting for him: a warm meal, a soft couch, and maybe, for once, a full night's sleep. But peace has a way of being fleeting. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror, piercing the tranquil night like an unwelcome alarm. Alex sighed, the weight of exhaustion sinking deeper into his chest. He pulled over, his tires crunching against the icy shoulder of the road. The chill seeped in the moment he rolled down his window. Two officers approached, one tall and imposing, with a face as cold as the weather, and the other younger, quieter, keeping a step behind. "License and registration," the taller officer barked. Alex complied without question, his mind racing for an explanation. He wasn't speeding, and as far as he knew, his truck was in good shape. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping in. "A tail lights out," the officer replied gruffly. "Step out of the vehicle." Alex blinked, confusion knitting his brow. A broken tail light didn't warrant this kind of escalation, did it? The freezing air clawed at him as he stepped out, his boots crunching against the snow-dusted pavement. The officer eyed him, a smirk curling on his lips. "Drop and give me 50 push-ups." For a moment, Alex thought he'd misheard. Push-ups? In the middle of the night? In weather cold enough to numb his hands and burn his lungs? He glanced at the second officer, hoping for some sign of reason. But the younger man avoided his gaze, shuffling uncomfortably in the background. "Start pushing, or you'll regret it," the first officer snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut through the icy wind. Alex's breath fogged the air as he hesitated. Every fiber of his being screamed at the absurdity of the command. But what choice did he have? Resistance could escalate this encounter into something far worse. So, he lowered himself onto the freezing asphalt, his palms stinging as they met the icy surface. One push-up, two. The cold bit harder with each movement, his muscles trembling under the strain. His breath came in short, visible bursts, mingling with the unforgiving frost. Passers-by hurried by, bundled against the cold, their eyes darting away from the scene. No one stopped. No one intervened. Alex was alone against the chill, both of the air and the officer's unchecked authority. But as he struggled through the push-ups, something stirred within him. A spark, a quiet defiance buried under the humiliation and frost. What Alex didn't know was that this freezing night, this moment of submission, would set off a chain of events that would change everything. For him, for the officers, for the entire town. By the time Alex finished the 50 push-ups, his hands were red and raw, his breath came in labored puffs, and his entire body shook, not just from the exertion, but from the cold. He pushed himself up, his knees unsteady on the icy ground, and stood facing the officers. The taller officer, Grant, watched him with a smug satisfaction, as if he'd just taught a valuable lesson. The younger officer, Davis, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flitting between Alex and the dark road ahead. "See? That wasn't so hard," Grant said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Maybe next time, you'll think twice before driving around with a busted taillight." Alex bit back the retort that rose to his lips. He wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the freezing air stole his words, and fear of further escalation kept him silent. He nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched tight. Grant handed back Alex's license and registration, a smirk still plastered across his face. "You're free to go," he said, his words cutting through the night like the icy wind. Alex climbed back into his truck, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. The heater sputtered weakly, but it did little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He sat there for a moment, staring at the road ahead, his mind racing. He saw a woman bundled in a thick coat and scarf. She held up a phone, her eyes filled with concern. Alex rolled down the window slightly. "I saw what they did," the woman said, her breath fogging the air. "I recorded it. You shouldn't let them get away with this." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Alex looked at her phone, the screen still glowing with the paused video. He hesitated. "I appreciate it," he said finally, his voice low. "But what can I do? They're cops. Who's going to believe me?" The woman frowned, her expression softening. "Sometimes, it's not about who believes you. It's about standing up for yourself. Here." She handed him a piece of paper with her contact information. "In case you need the video." With that, she disappeared into the night, leaving Alex alone once again. As he drove home, the weight of the encounter settled heavier on his chest. The cold wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside, creeping into his thoughts. By the time Alex pulled into his driveway, one thing had become clear. He couldn't let this slide. But standing up to the officers felt like an impossible task. After all, who was he to challenge authority? What the officers didn't know, however, was that Alex Carter wasn't just another average citizen. He was a rising entrepreneur, well-connected in the community. And though he didn't know it yet, this humiliating night would be the spark that ignited a movement. The wheels of justice were about to turn, but not in the direction Officer Grant expected. The night was restless. Alex sat in his living room, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The events of the previous evening replayed in his mind, each memory sharper than the last. Humiliation had settled in his chest like a heavy stone, but beneath it, anger began to stir. The slip of paper with the woman's contact information lay on the table. Next to it, his phone buzzed with messages, friends checking in, local group chats lighting up about the push-up incident. The video was spreading fast, and with it came voices of outrage from strangers who had never met him but shared his disbelief and fury. "It's not about who believes you. It's about standing up for yourself." The woman's words echoed in his thoughts, louder than the silence of his empty house. By dawn, Alex had made up his mind. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he needed, Eric Martinez. Eric's voice on the other end of the line was sharp and reassuring. When Alex finished recounting the story, there was a pause, followed by an incredulous response. "They made you do what?" Eric's tone carried equal parts disbelief and anger. 50 push-ups, Alex repeated, the embarrassment still fresh. On ice. In freezing weather. And all because of a broken tail light. "That's not just misconduct, that's abuse," Eric said firmly. "If you're ready to push back, I'll stand with you." The words gave Alex his first taste of confidence since the incident. That afternoon, the video began spreading like wildfire. The footage showed Alex shivering on the icy ground, his breath fogging the air as he struggled through push-ups. Officer Grant's barking orders were loud and clear, his tone dripping with condescension. It didn't take long for the local news stations to pick up the story. Headlines like, "Push-up punishment," "Local man humiliated by police," flooded social media. Community forums buzzed with outrage. "This is unacceptable. Who do these officers think they are? Someone give this guy legal help. We need accountability now." The clip reached city officials and even the mayor, who promised a full investigation. Within hours, the police department faced mounting pressure to respond. While the video sparked a public outcry, Alex sat in Eric's office, his nerves battling with determination. The lawyer leaned forward, the screen of his tablet replaying the damning footage for the 10th time. "This is as clear-cut as it gets," Eric said. "They violated your rights, plain and simple. We'll file a formal complaint, push for an internal investigation, and take this as far as it needs to go." Alex's hands rested on the desk, his knuckles white as he nodded. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes, let's do it." For the first time, Alex felt the weight begin to lift. The officers had pushed him down, but now he was rising, ready to fight for justice. not just for himself, but for anyone who'd been silenced by fear or power. In that moment, the cold night of humiliation transformed into the start of something bigger. The police department's statement was released the next morning. It was brief and vague, claiming the incident was under review and urging the public to avoid speculation. But by then, the video had already reached regional news outlets, and reporters were digging deeper into the officers involved. Officer Grant's name quickly surfaced. Known for his aggressive tactics and history of complaints, he was no stranger to controversy. Officer Davis, the younger and quieter of the two, also came under scrutiny for his silence during the incident. The community's response was swift. Protesters gathered outside the police station, braving the freezing weather with signs demanding accountability. Justice for Alex. No excuse for abuse. Stop police overreach. Local leaders joined the chorus, amplifying the calls for a thorough investigation. Meanwhile, Alex and Eric worked tirelessly to build their case. Sitting in Eric's office, they reviewed the mounting evidence. The video was their centerpiece, but Eric had also gathered witness statements from those who had seen the incident or watched the video. Even Officer Grant's past complaints came into play, painting a picture of a man who had long abused his power. "This isn't just about one bad night," Eric said, pacing as he read through the complaints. "It's about a pattern of behavior, and it's time to break it." Alex, sitting at the desk, felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. "How far do you think they'll go to protect him?" he asked. "As far as they can," Eric replied. "But the public's on your side now. That's a game changer." The police department's initial attempts to downplay the situation only added fuel to the fire. When Officer Grant's disciplinary history leaked, public outrage reached a boiling point. Calls flooded the mayor's office, demanding immediate action. In response, the department announced that both officers had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. It wasn't enough for the protesters, but it was a start. For Alex, it felt like a small victory, but the fight was far from over. Days later, Alex was invited to speak at a town hall meeting organized by local activists. The room was packed with community members, reporters, and officials. Standing at the podium, Alex felt the weight of every eye in the room. He took a deep breath. "This isn't just about me," he began. "It's about ensuring no one else has to go through what I did. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was a failure of accountability. And that needs to change." The applause was thunderous. People stood, cheering for the man who had turned his humiliation into a rallying cry for justice. As the pressure on the department intensified, Eric filed a formal lawsuit against the police department and Officer Grant. The charges included misconduct, abuse of authority, and emotional distress. "We're not just seeking compensation," Eric said during a press conference. "We're demanding reform." The town's lead #### Part 5, the climax. Alex sat on the witness stand, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on him. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his experience. "That night was supposed to be a normal drive home," he began. "I wasn't speeding. I wasn't reckless. My only mistake was a broken tail light, something I hadn't even noticed. But what happened after that was not about safety. It was about power." He described the events in vivid detail. The cold biting through his jacket, the barked orders, the humiliation of being forced to do push-ups on frozen asphalt. As he spoke, the viral video played on the screen behind him, capturing every painful second. The courtroom watched in silence, the imagery stark and undeniable. "I wasn't treated like a person," Alex continued, his voice faltering slightly. "I was treated like an object, something to be controlled and humiliated. I obeyed because I was scared, not because I had done anything to deserve it." The prosecutor followed up with pointed questions, drawing out the emotional and physical impact of the ordeal. Alex's voice grew firmer as he described the humiliation, the sleepless nights, and the fear of retaliation. The courtroom seemed to hang on his every word. Outside the courthouse, the streets were alive with protest. Community members, outraged by the video, had taken to the streets. They carried signs reading, "Justice for Alex," and *, "Hold them accountable." Asterisk chanting filled the air as local leaders spoke to the crowd, demanding transparency and reform within the police department. As Alex stood in front of a crowd at a community meeting, he felt the weight of his journey. The room was full of familiar faces, the same people who had rallied around him from the start. Their support had been unwavering, and together, they had changed the course of the future. "None of this would have been possible without all of you," Alex said, his voice strong but filled with gratitude. "This isn't just my victory. It's our victory. And this is just the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause, not just for Alex, but for everything he had inspired. The strength to demand change, the courage to stand up for justice, and the unyielding belief that power should never be abused, especially by those sworn to protect. The fight wasn't over. It never would be, as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and hold those in power accountable. But for Alex, for the community, and for the future of the town, this was a resolution, a victory, and a new beginning. Months had passed since the trial, but for Alex, the experience was still fresh in his mind. The pain, the fear, the anger, it was all still there, lingering like an old scar that wouldn't quite heal. But something else had changed in him too. The anger had transformed into a quiet strength, and the fear had given way to a new kind of courage. Sitting by the window of his small apartment, Alex watched the world outside, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The town had shifted, and so had he. The once quiet and unassuming man who had dreaded speaking up had now become a symbol of resilience, a man who had found his voice in the face of injustice. He thought about the night when the officers had forced him into those humiliating push-ups on the icy ground. It had been a moment that tested him in ways he never expected. But looking back now, Alex could see that it was also the moment that changed his life forever. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about the responsibility to fight when others couldn't. "I never thought I'd be here," he whispered to himself, as the echoes of the protests and courtroom speeches filled his memory. "I never thought I'd be the one to stand up." The thought brought a smile to his face. He had stood up, and now he was stronger for it. The town was beginning to heal. The protests had faded, and the noise of the headlines had quieted. But the changes remained. The police department had implemented the reforms, and while some were skeptical about their effectiveness, others saw real progress. Trust, once broken, was slowly being rebuilt. People had started speaking out, their voices no longer hushed by fear. And in the midst of it all, Alex had become a symbol, not just of resistance, but of hope. He had turned his personal trauma into something that empowered others. Local news outlets often featured him, not as a victim, but as an advocate for fairness, for justice, for accountability. He had become a voice for those who had felt powerless, and a reminder to the community that the fight for what's right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. At a local gathering, Alex was invited to speak. He stood in front of a crowd of neighbors, community leaders, and students, the same people who had rallied around him when it had all begun. He cleared his throat, feeling a sense of responsibility settle in. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for the people who couldn't, the ones still afraid to challenge authority. "We're all part of this community," he began, his voice calm but firm. "We all deserve respect. We all deserve to be treated fairly. What happened to me should never happen again. But it will only change if we stay vigilant. If we continue to demand accountability, not just from others, but from ourselves too." The crowd listened intently, nodding in agreement. There was a sense of solidarity now, a shared understanding that change wasn't just about the big moments. It was about the everyday acts of courage, the decisions to speak up and do the right thing, no matter the cost. In the months that followed, Alex worked with local organizations to promote awareness about police reform, community engagement, and citizens' rights. He traveled to other towns, sharing his story, urging others to stand up for justice. He had become more than just a local figure. He had become a voice for the broader movement for fairness and accountability in law enforcement. The town, too, had changed. People had begun to trust one another more, knowing they no longer had to live in fear. New leaders emerged, inspired by Alex's example, and together, they pushed for a future where power was used responsibly and where the voices of the people were never ignored. Looking back, Alex could see the journey clearly now. From fear to action, from humiliation to strength,